Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, July 11th edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle Cluster API Working Group meeting. Today's agenda is looking reasonably full, so we're going to just dive right in. It looks like the first one is about a PR that hasn't gotten merged yet, number 408. Let's see, David, do you want to give a little background on this one? I haven't seen it yet. I know, is David here?
I believe he mentioned that he was going to be running about 30 minutes late to the meeting in chat.
Oh, okay, so maybe I shouldn't have put his thing at the beginning. Let's go to the next one and we'll come back to that.
All right, this one's mine. As I started working through a POC of a cluster API implementation, I noticed that there is a significant difference between the cluster and machine actuator interfaces and also the controller code as well. I put a PR out there to basically solicit feedback on aligning the two interfaces and the behaviors. But to give a brief overview, right now, the machine controller, the instance that it passes to the actuator is actually a deep copy of the informer provided object, so that you can actually mutate that object without having to worry about mutating the cache. The cluster controller doesn't currently do that. And I think it should. And also the actuator interfaces for a machine, you have create, update, delete, and exists. And the cluster is just reconcile and delete right now. And it's just odd spinning up onto cluster API and coming up to speed and trying to reconcile those differences. So I think they should align a little bit more.
Yeah, so I just put a link in chat from a comment that Kenny made about 2 weeks ago on a different PR, basically asking the same question and why they weren't the same. So I don't know if Kenny, if you or Megan wants to say anything about the status of where we think we should head with the controller.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so I agree with you that the actuator interface is really clunky right now, and I'm all for making it more similar to the machine actuator, as well as your comment about the passing down a copy of the object. And again, the cluster controller should be doing that as well. So I'm +1 on going forward with that change.
Yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
So I guess for a cluster, I found it a little bit more confusing to implement the exist method, because a cluster is made up of a lot of resources where a machine is typically one VM. So I guess we'd have to decide what it means for a cluster to exist. Is it that every resource exists, or that, I don't know, because what if it started creating and then failed halfway through? The next time it wouldn't exist, or it was just a little bit confusing when I was implementing it originally for GCE.
Yes, I agree as well, and I had a similar kind of odd behavior as well around doing that. The way that I've been handling it is basically treat a cluster that's not fully created, like all the resources are created, is not created, but then you get the odd behavior where the create method is basically the same as the existing reconcile method. But I think that there is still a value in being able to differentiate create versus update, so that if somebody's mutating the cluster configuration, you can more easily handle that separately from the create operation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think also for a cluster, a lot of the things maybe can't be updated, but it depends on the provider, I think.
Yeah, that was one of my major concerns is you don't want to be able to like mutate the CIDR on a VPC or something like that. So I think having the update versus the create will give you the ability to more easily do a quick check on that and fail.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
Anyway, happy for more feedback on the actual PR, and we can work through that, I think.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I think that it sounds like there's pretty much general agreement that we should try to make them look similar. All right, so I moved your other one next, Jason, bootstrapping AWS provider implementation.
Yes, I know this is something that we've talked about. The existing provider that's linked right now, as far as what we've discussed, is the OpenShift implementation, but it's not really generic enough to be a kind of generic Kubernetes cluster API implementation. So I wanted to see if there was interest in going ahead and spinning up an official kind of repo and starting work on kind of bootstrapping and AWS implementation.
What kind of interest are you looking for? Are you looking for other people to help write and own the code? Are you looking for, I think that's a good idea. I don't have bandwidth to actually like contribute code or reviews or anything.
Yeah, so currently, as part of the work I'm doing with Heptio, we're doing a internal proof of concept of cluster API based on AWS, and we'd be happy to help contribute some of that work back towards the community and help use that to help bootstrap it as well. But any other contributors that are happy to join, provide feedback, and help with testing or even implementation, we're more than happy to kind of work with.
This is Cindy from Samsung. I work with David Watson, and we have a deadline of October to get something working with AWS. So we're going to try to do something also with Cluster API and our own provider. So we would be interested in helping with that.
Yeah, I was going to mention in David's absence that he has said in previous meetings that he's looking for a place to work together with the community on AWS implementation. So I think we have at least people from Samsung and Heptio working together there, if not more folks jumping in. We
could probably follow the outline. We should follow the outline that DIMS had created for how we want to create new repos. So I can point to a link of what the process we should probably follow to create the new repository. And we can just create a separate instance there and then work out the details and logistics at the end.
That sounds great. We were also wondering, I was going to try it out to see if Cube Builder can be used to just create our provider, our external provider, since we're not using aggregated API. So has anyone tried that, using Cube Builder to generate code?
So the catch right now is that the centralized cluster API implementation is using API server builder right now and is an aggregated API server. So it's locked into Kubernetes 1.9 right now. So it really isn't easy to use Cube Builder. But there's another topic to talk about, potentially switching to CRDs, which might ease that.
Okay, that's good to know. And so for now, you do have to use the API builder method to generate, correct? If you're going to add it.
So you don't actually have to use the API server builder method to generate the implementations right now, but it has to at least interoperate with the API server built implementations.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Tim, I don't know if Dims is on the line. Let me scroll through the people. Oh yeah, Dims is here. Can you or Dims give an update on creating the repo for OpenStack? Because I've seen some emails going back and forth, but haven't looked too closely.
So as of an hour ago, we do have a repo. So yay! So that's the good news. It took a while just to figuring out, do we want to start with an empty repo, or do we need to fill it in, and what do we fill it in, and who the owner should be, and things like that. So I have a template. So if the next people who follow, I can probably help them jumpstart the process. So yeah, we have a repo. So now the next step is how do we do clusterctl create, for example, right? with the new provider. I do have one PR, which was following the same thing that we did in Cloud Provider on how to plug in external external providers. So I would like to see some progress on that PR. And then we do have a choice to make, which is, do we kind of like vendor the OpenStack repository or not? And how would it work? Currently, there was one PR that was merged with Azure, which just said when clusterctl create is executed, it just throws an exception saying, okay, not yet implemented. But how do we actually connect the two is the basic question. So ideas are welcome here, I think.
Yeah, I think Jason had a thing lower on the agenda to discuss this specifically, so I moved that up to talk about next. But
okay, we can move to that unless anybody has a question on the OpenStack provider itself.
Yeah, no, I think it's great news that we now have the repo and that we have a template for creating more. I would suggest, Jason, if you and Cindy or you and David can follow that template, we should be able to get one up and running for the AWS provider code pretty quickly. It sounds like now that DIMS has plowed the trail and gone through all the trouble.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to follow up with DIMS and go ahead and get that kick-started.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on to the other question, which is how do we use clusterctl when you have an out-of-tree provider? I will also provide the background here that we do want to move the Google code out. So this will be a problem for everybody, not just non-Google people, hopefully, in the quote near future. And so we should solve the problem with the idea that no provider code will be in the main repo soonish. So I think there have been the PR I think, Dims, you were alluding to is that there is an interface in the main code that has two functions in it, so that we can, I believe it's get an IP address and fetch a kubeconfig. I think are the two things we need to do that right now are provider specific. And I think we have, for one of those, we have a design for how to get rid of that interface method. And for the other, we don't yet. Ideally, we'd get rid of both of them and delete the interface and not have to vendor anything back into the main repo or not have any sort of compile time dependencies on all the different providers. But we need to figure out how to get rid of that interface and actually make the cluster up work without it first. So as far as I understand, that's what's currently blocking us. And so I think we have the long-term solution. We need to figure out how we get it out. And then tactically, the short-term, we need to figure out what we do in the meantime before we understand how to take it out.
Right. So for right now, one option that seems to me that's possible is if we do the pull 360, right, that will give us a way to, plug in the existing stuff as it is. Then the only other issue would be we need an import from the vendor repository, right? So to be able to register the provider. So what we could have is like a temporary copy of clusterctl, the command itself in the OpenStack repository. So we can do the import there and try things out and make sure things are working while we are debating about how to get rid of the two interface methods.
Okay, so if I understand what you said is one option is we basically, since we're going to vendor the cluster API into OpenStack anyway, because we need all of the API types and other generated code, that will vendor the clusterctl
too, yeah,
in as well, and we can sort of monkey patch it there. Right. And if you want to run OpenStack, you'd run that clusterctl instead of the main one because it actually has the OpenStack provider registered.
Right, and the only difference would be the import, and there should be no other changes required to use that clusterctl.
I think that sounds really great for making sure we can get it up and running. It doesn't sound super maintainable to me as we start having multiple providers. So I think if we do that, that's going to need to also sort of bump up the priority of trying to figure out how to move away from that solution.
Can't you follow the kube control plugin model, very similar to that model, to do the clusterctl for different providers? They have a unique solution that's actually kind of clever. that allows you to do plugins for kubectl. So if you had your own extension mechanisms, like you created a third-party CRD, and you wanted to link that into kubectl, not link into kubectl, but be able to execute it via kubectl, there's mechanisms for that capability. It sounds very analogous to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question we have to answer is do we long-term need a plugin model, or is this something that is really a short-term pain? And if we don't need it long-term, how much effort does it take to build one to alleviate the short-term pain?
Yeah, my vote would be to get rid of the interface with the two methods for as quickly as possible. But then until we get there, I would like a short-term option which is partially palatable, that can at least be used for trying things out. I don't know what other people think.
Yeah, I know. When I had a hallway conversation with Chris Rousey, when you first sent that PR, we sort of had the same, like, if we merge this, we should clearly document that this interface is not ever getting bigger and that we are actively trying to make it smaller and delete this. So if this is sort of a helpful forcing function to make us delete it quicker, I think that might also be beneficial.
Okay, so let's continue on the PR, I guess. That's all I had. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Jason, does that answer your question about roadmap for out-of-tree providers sufficiently, or was there more you wanted to say about that?
No, I think that covers all my concerns. Thank you.
Sweet. Chris, I saw that you showed up. Let's talk about your two agenda items. The first one is Kubecon. Oh no, did Chris leave?
We can't hear you, Chris.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, you are very, very quiet.
What about now?
That's much better.
Okay, cool. Sorry, Linux problems. That's why I haven't been talking this whole time. Okay, yeah. So the first one I have is, do we want to grab a room for Seattle or China for Kubecon? I'm not going to be at China, but if other folks are, we can totally book you a room. So show of hands, or do we want to maybe shoot out an email, or what are folks thinking?
So we discussed this a little bit during the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting yesterday. And lots of people, it sounded like we're going to be in Seattle, and nobody, it sounded like, was going to be in China. We have one person from Google who might be in China, did a talk, and if his talk gets accepted, he will go. If his talk doesn't get accepted, I'm not sure if he will go or not.
Okay. Then I would propose we do, based on a lazy consensus, let's book a room for Seattle and leave China on the back burner.
Yeah, so back burner isn't too far back because the deadline for filling out this form for China is actually pretty soon. So unless we hear from someone that they are willing to run this event in China, I think in the next couple of weeks, then we're going to miss our opportunity to grab a room unless they're willing to get us one at the last minute, which has happened before. So that's certainly possible.
Yeah, or we can always just stand around in the hallway.
True. So for Seattle, I actually filled out the form last night to schedule an intro and a deep dive for cluster lifecycle. And since the last deep dive in Europe was on kubeadmin, I wrote the description for the deep dive to be on the cluster API for Seattle. And then I put in the notes field to Dan that I really wanted to have 2 deep dives for our SIG because we have sort of 2 major projects, and that would make a lot of sense to me. I don't know if it would make sense to just fill out the form twice and ask for them specifically separate or not.
What is the other deep dive we're thinking of doing?
One on kubeadmin and one on cluster API would be ideal.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think filling out the form twice makes sense.
Okay, I will just go fill out the form again and just check the box for deep dive and fill out the description for the kubeadmin deep dive then, and that should get us signed up for both. It does ask for who's going to run it, and I also put in the notes field that I signed myself and Tim up as sort of proxies because we will figure out who's going to run it later.
Okay. Is that for kubeadmin or for cluster API?
So I did that for the SIG cluster lifecycle intro and the cluster API deep dive, and I will also do that for kubeadmin, and then we'll probably through this meeting for the cluster API one figure out sort of who's going to lead that deep dive, and in the kubeadmin breakout meeting we can figure out who's going to lead the kubeadmin deep dive.
Sounds good.
And in the main meeting, we'll figure out who's going to lead the intro thing. I know that for Europe, we had a set of sort of new people doing that, which was great. I think that sort of spreading around the faces we get in front of people is pretty nice. Okay, so I will take an action for that one. So next one is aggregate API server versus CRDs.
Okay. I feel like this is kind of a hot button issue, but I wanted to bring it up. When we originally had the discussion, we talked about bringing it up later once CRDs are a little more complete, whatever that means. So I wanted to get a feel for folks' opinions and thoughts and concerns around potentially moving back from an aggregate API server to a CRD. And I'll just leave it there and let folks jump in.
It would be ideal. I mean, I brought up this topic with Chris several times and I also talked with Robbie. It'd be ideal to get a listing of the requirements of what things are needed by Cluster API and to help determine the choice. I look through the history and I think a lot of the original concerns that were there no longer apply to the current state of CRDs. And there are some inherent benefits of CRDs. And if we're going to make any decision or choice, making it before the cut to beta is probably prudent. So I wanted to at least have the conversation before folks start to tread towards the beta roadmap, because the decision we make now could have lasting effects, especially if the long-term objective of all the APIs inside of Kubernetes is to eventually become CRDs of some kind.
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of background here. We had Eric Toon join our meeting a number of months ago to discuss this topic when he had started pushing in the larger community for people to stop using aggregate API servers and everyone to use CRDs, which was right around the time that we were going in the opposite direction and trying to switch from CRDs that we used in the initial prototype to using aggregate API servers. And at the time, we looked at the delta between the two, and there were a number of things we needed from aggregate API servers. Those were all on the roadmap for CRDs, but we weren't sure how soon they were going to show up. They are now starting to show up. So if you look at like what's in CRDs in 1.11 and what's coming in 1.12, a lot of the things that we needed are going to be there relatively soon, if they're not already there in the release that just cut. I think it would be really useful to go through and look at, if we do want to implement custom validation and support for API object versioning with CRDs, what does that actually look like? And how different is it from having to do it with aggregate APIs? Because I think you get some of it for free, but you also have to implement a whole bunch of webhooks to make it work. So I think it might still be a sort of non-trivial bit of integration plumbing, even with CRDs, to actually get this.
Yeah, I think we should just do an honest evaluation of like what are the trade-offs and what are the requirements long-term for what we want to do. The notion of not having to provision and pivot and being able to use an existing cluster is a highly beneficial thing for a lot of folks too as well as the dependency graph issues that currently exist with the current implementation.
Right. Yeah, I think the other thing we talked about with Eric was that we didn't see there were I think maybe two things or one thing that people brought up that you could do with aggregated API servers that you couldn't do with CRDs that we might be interested in doing in the long term. And one of those was custom sub-resources. So with CRDs, we plan on maybe supporting like the scale sub-resource, but really no others. And with aggregate API servers, you can make arbitrary sub-resources. So if we wanted to do things like have a sub-resource on machines that allowed you to like reboot a machine, right? You could make a custom verb in your REST definition that rebooted a machine. And you could do that with an aggregate API server, but you'll probably never be able to do that with CRDs. So we should figure out if that's something that sounds nice, but we would never do in practice, or something that we think would actually be useful down the road.
There's also the trick where an aggregate API server can be accessed sort of from two clusters. In other words, you can access it inside the cluster that you're spinning up and before the cluster that you're spinning up exists, right? And I don't know if we're actually using that functionality at the moment or have plans to.
So you're talking about basically having like a different endpoint that you can talk directly to the aggregate API server if the primary one is down.
Well, it's the the direct endpoint rather than going via
yes,
aggregation.
I did say that backwards, right?
So
You don't have to go through the sort of Kubernetes cluster endpoint, which is typically tightly coupled with like the etcd for all of your jobs that might be crashing. Right, like we've definitely seen cases where that API server starts crash looping, and then if you can't talk to the API server that's storing your machine objects, then it may be difficult to recover from that state.
So I have a question related to that, though, is if the goal is to stay on an aggregated API server, what's the plan for supported tooling to be able to do that? Because it looks like API Server Builder is kind of abandoned.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, again, when we talked to Eric a while back, he promised us that they wouldn't abandon the things we were using to build aggregate API servers, at least until, basically everybody had moved over to CRDs. So I think that's a really good question that we should follow up and make sure that sort of promise is still in effect. Back to Justin's point briefly, the other thing that's been mentioned about using CRDs is that with CRDs, you can actually have sort of flexible deployment models where you could still run a separate Kubernetes API server and disable all of the core APIs and just put your custom resources in it. And then you still get the advantage of having a separate API endpoint for your custom resources that's separate from the main sort of API server and the main etcd storage without having to run the API server builder or maintain your own API server binary. So the API machinery team is working on adding some sort of flag or configuration to the API server to basically say, I want to run this API server in a mode where it doesn't advertise any of the core APIs. It's just available for CRD registration to support that use case.
I didn't even know that. That's actually kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really nice because it's going to make the deployment sort of flexible and decoupled from having to maintain your own binaries, which is going to be awesome.
It kind of almost sounds like an aggregated API server.
Kind of. I mean, it's basically like I run my own binary and I put my own resources in it if I want to decouple failure domains or storage domains or something else, right?
Yeah,
And then aggregate them together. So,
and to be clear, that would then support aggregation with a CRD?
I believe what would happen is you'd put your CRDs into that API server, right. But then it would also register with the aggregate API server. So you'd still have a single endpoint where you could see everything like you do today, but you'd have separation of storage and so forth, like we do when we run our own custom binary.
And could we build that API server today by basically taking what we've got and just not registering anything, any custom types, and just putting in the CRDs?
I think maybe. I think that they're trying to build sort of more first-class support for this, where the API server just sort of does this itself instead of us having to hack the code. Because that, again, if you hack that generated code, then that becomes a maintenance nightmare as you try to move up to from 1.9 to 1.10.
So I guess the question is, I know you've talked about it, we've talked about it. Are there folks that are going to like deep dive the requirements analysis here to understand what's the plan going forwards, especially for beta and for eventual GA, of what folks think they want to do? I think requirements analysis first makes a ton of sense, right?
Yeah, I think I don't know that I have time to drive that right this second. If someone wants to get the ball started, I can dig up the documents we produced when we made this switch the other direction, which probably at least implicitly contains some of those requirements. If anybody wants to start that now. Otherwise, I think, as you're saying, this is maybe more of a beta thing. And if we, like right now, I'm more focused on trying to burn down the list of alpha issues so we can actually cut and create a release process and build an alpha release. And then after that, would start looking at things like this for a beta release. If anyone wants to get started now, that'd be great.
Yeah. I think, is there, how many alphas do you intend?
I don't know, at least one.
So one thing that I'd be concerned about is, are we going to hit a point where the vendored version of client Go that we're using right now will no longer be able to talk to an API server? Like right now, we can talk to a 1.11 API server and everything appears to work just fine. Is that going to continue through 1.12, or are we going to hit kind of like an upstream deadline where we're going to have to be off of the 1.9 code?
Yeah, I don't know what the SKU support matrix for client Go is. I assume it's similar to kubectl, which is basically one minor version, right? So 1.9 to 1.11 is probably not sort of officially supported, right? Like if we hit bugs, they may say that's not going to be fixed. I know there is an open issue for us to upgrade from 1.9 to 1.10 for our API server builder. I don't know if anybody's actively tried to do that yet.
Well, there's still an open issue for API server builder itself to support 1.10. So,
okay, which goes back to what you were saying before about the product feeling stagnant.
Correct.
All right, so I guess if that continues to be the case, then that sort of accelerates the need for us to more seriously look at moving back to CRDs, right? Because we are going to want to be able to support like running Kubernetes at a new version. Okay. Does anyone want to take an action to sort of keep pulling on this thread? Maybe to talk to Phil Whitrock or someone from the team that's maintaining API server builder and see what their status is, or start pulling together the requirements to compare and contrast CRDs versus aggregate API servers.
I'll be happy to help. It looks like Chris is waving.
I didn't see any waving, sorry. I don't see all the people. Which Chris Nova? Is that you waving?
We can't hear you, Chris.
Yeah, sorry. Audio problems, but yeah, I'll take that action item.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
I can also talk to Phil Whitrock as well, find out what's going on.
Yeah,
okay.
I
Chris,
will.
You and Justin talk together and figure out a path forward. Would be awesome. Okay, next, Daniel, you have a question about provider config to provider spec. I think I was reviewing this PR. Let's see.
Yeah, hopefully not trying to be too pedantic, but as I've been working with the API and you know using quite a bit of provider status for both cluster and machine, I realized that there was this kind of it was a little odd that there was a provider config and a provider status. So I just wanted to, I filed an issue, just wanted to get the question out there, you know, early, since, you know, we're still pre-alpha or maybe in alpha. So we have the chance to change it now if we want to. So the reasoning behind this is that there is a provider status, and that the convention in the Kubernetes API is a spec and a status, and cluster API is using config, provider config with provider status. So maybe it would make sense to use provider spec.
You are probably right. I'm trying to pull up the the types. We probably were not super careful on exactly the word we use for each of these things.
When I looked at the KEP, I quoted this in the issue, right? That there was, I think the thought was that, hey, it's like the component config pattern, so maybe that's where it originated. And I think provider status came in a PR much later. So it makes sense that historically it was provider config.
Okay. I don't know if anybody else on the call has thoughts or opinions, or if we need to digest a little bit and come back. It sounds like you are probably barking up the right tree here, but I need to look a little more closely to be sure. Okay, let's in-queue this again for next week. And if we haven't wrapped it up offline before this meeting next week, we can come back and try to get a conclusion at that point and give people a few minutes to read it outside of the meeting.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. So next we're back to poll number 408. I don't know if David is here.
Yes, I am.
Hello. Oh, it looks nice where you are.
Feels nice.
Okay, so you sent a PR a couple weeks ago and asking if we should merge this.
Right. So, so originally I posted this because it was some work for me to find out who was developing repos where. Now that it appears we have consensus and we actually have an OpenShift implementation under the Kubernetes SIGs organization, I'm less certain how important this is. I mean, I don't expect all providers to be migrated to the SIGs organization immediately. So there's probably still value in having pointers. But as more providers become part of the organization, it may suffice to just explain what the naming convention is and how to find them. So that way we would reduce the maintenance overhead. Like this morning, I had to update the PR to show the new location of the OpenShift implementation. And I personally don't think that's useful work for anybody.
Yeah, I do think it is useful if someone's looking at the README to sort of see, like, here are the different environments that are supported and where I can go to learn more about those. So I think that that part of your PR makes a lot of sense. I also agree that as we standardize on where to put the code, maybe it becomes less important. So I would vote that we merge this now, and then we can reassess later as we get more standardization of where the providers live. I mean, even at that point, if someone comes to look at the cluster API repo, it's no longer going to have any code that will actually be useful to actually create a cluster, right? You're going to have to go somewhere else to get the bit of glue to actually run on a specific environment. So even at that point, having pointers to, here's some common ones that are actively being supported by the SIG might still make sense.
Okay.
So yeah, I hadn't seen this. I think maybe I'll poke Dims again about the PR auto assigner. Does this have an assignee? It just hadn't been reviewed yet, or was it unassigned?
Somebody gave it an LGGM, but then I updated it, which revoked that. So someone needs to go okay it again and then merge.
All right, cool. Awesome. I just LGTM'd it. It should merge shortly. Oh, it also needs approval. That's probably why it didn't merge in the first place. Okay, so next I put something on here. Last night I just went through the alpha release milestone and tried to close or poke issues that looked like they were stale or maybe obsolete, trying to reduce that list. I would also put a call out for people that if you're creating new issues that you think should be part of the alpha milestone, please use the /milestone command to add it to the milestone. Because as we are trying to actually get to a release, hopefully in the next couple of months, sort of before the next Kubernetes release happens, that's going to be the place to look to sort of burn down what is outstanding. So if you have bugs that you think should block us cutting an alpha release, if you have changes that should block us cutting an alpha release, please tag it with the milestone, because then it'll pop up more easily on people's radar to bring to this meeting and get community consensus on.
What's the?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Lumir.
I think they have to be a milestone maintainer to do that, Robert.
So not everybody can do /milestone with the number. Okay.
Yes.
Well, if the bot rejects you from doing that, you can add me or somebody else who can manually edit labels. I think Chris Nova can also. Do you think does that apply also to the Kubernetes SIGs organization? I know that the way that permissions are set up in that organization is slightly different from the main Kubernetes organization.
I guess you should try it, but I think it applies to everything.
Okay. I think when I try to do it, it works, but I have,
yeah.
So that doesn't tell me anything useful. So maybe I'll throw it out there. The next time you think something should be added, try to run the command, and if it doesn't work, we'll try to figure out how we can get that fixed.
I had a question with regards to testing for the release. How are we going to manage and notify what providers have been tested for what configuration of what release?
So one of the open issues for the alpha release, and I was going back and forth in my head last night about whether this should be alpha or maybe beta, was to start creating a sort of conformance suite. So along the lines of what Kubernetes has for conformance for 1.10, 1.11, we'd be able to say this cluster API release is been tested to be conformant on these different providers. I think that's going to be a discussion as we get closer and sort of burn down the obvious things, and we actually have multiple providers that we want to test and validate. We'll need to figure out what that process looks like.
Okay,
I don't have a great answer yet.
If you have an issue that you can point me at, I'm sure Hip Hacker's there too. We can probably both chime in on that one, for beta at least.
Yeah, right now it's tagged with alpha, so we can decide if that's the correct place or not. I definitely think it would be a blocker for beta, though. All right, Daniel, office hours.
Yeah, it just occurred to me that I would find it helpful to maybe have a regular time every week where provider implementers can discuss the things like design, maybe implementation tips or hurdles, anything from using dep to encoding, decoding the provider config status, etc., things like that. I think there are a number of people working on providers, right? Google, right? vSphere, there's I guess OpenShift, there are lots of them. So I'm not sure how best to sort of come up with a time. Maybe file an issue, maybe create a Google Sheets. Any takers? Any suggestions on how to get that organized? I'd be happy to do that.
We've used like a spreadsheet before in the past to sort of do like a best fit for a time. So we could totally draft an email to SIG Cluster Lifecycle and attach a spreadsheet that lets folks kind of vote on a time if it's something that we think is worthwhile. For what it's worth, I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
I'd recommend Doodle where possible. We've used it on a number of other SIGs, and it's highly useful.
Yeah, solves. Okay. Basically does the same thing. Yeah.
Doodle. Okay. I'll so just set one of those up and send it to the mailing list.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be great. There's a little comment thread to Google Doc where other people are also plus wanting this idea.
Yeah.
So I think it sounds like there's enough interest to at least send out the doodle, and hopefully enough people put in preferences there that we can have a sufficient number of people to sort of keep this going.
A quick request to make it accessible to people in Asia Pacific, including myself. Meetings starting at 2:30 in the morning are not great.
Yeah, so I think that's part of the reason for the spreadsheet or the doodle is to try to figure out like what times work for the people that will actually show up, right? Because we tend to skew for people who are here. Like, so you're in Asia Pacific, and I know Lubomir's sort of on the opposite side, and it's also late.
Yeah, it's the evening for me, but I guess it's fine. I'm used to it.
Just want to make sure there's options for voting on it. We can have those preferences on the end. Sometimes there's no options later than 3:30 a.m. in the morning for me, and that's hard. Yeah, that's a really good point. Oftentimes, the only available slots to select from are like between 9 and maybe noon Pacific time or something, which is probably all middle of the night for you. So presumably Daniel heard that, and he will create a wide spectrum of times for people to vote on.
Yeah. If after the vote, if Daniel, if you need help setting up the actual call or anything, I'm happy to assist along the way.
Thank you. I will reach out. Thanks.
Regardless of time, this is super exciting.
Nice.
Cool. All right, so that was the end of the agenda that people had proposed. Is there anything else people want to talk about? We've got about 10 minutes left, or we can get 10 minutes back.
I know that we had the cross cloud project sponsored by the CNCF that has a lot of cloud providers because we were continuously deploying to many different providers, and it might be a good effort to, as we're going through these alpha stages, to repurpose all of that code into some either generic cluster API module that uses that code. I know that it's all Terraform based, but the templating and the availability for it to work across all those providers is pretty clean. I definitely would want to modify it out to use QADM, but just wanted to kind of throw that out there and get some feedback on how difficult that would be and where we might find the resources for that.
So I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that. Which provider are you talking about?
So there's the CNCF cross-cloud project, and it supports many different providers. If you just go to CNCF CI, there's the dashboard there. I'm going to drop that in the channel. You'll see AWS, Azure, GC, IBM Cloud, Packet, OpenStack, and vSphere. And there's the code base that drives that is, let me see if I can drop the link here. If anybody, Volk or Watson, if you've got that link handy.
I already dropped there.
Thanks. That's the code base, and the templates are there for the different providers and the different master templates. It's pretty close, and I think it would be I kind of wanted to get a measure of how difficult it would be to merge and where we might find the resources to do that, because it would be a big jumpstart getting us to a lot of different providers being able to use Cluster API in this alpha stage as we figure out, if we just write some generic thing to repurpose this, it would be great, I think.
Yeah, one of the things that Chris and I talked about early on was using Terraform or Docker machine or something like that as sort of a lowest common denominator for environments that didn't have a more specific controller written for them, which I think is sort of along the lines of what you're saying. Is if we use this as sort of a Terraform provider, it would get you running in lots of different places. And then, if it ran in AWS and then we implemented a specific AWS one, you could just use that instead of the Terraform one for AWS. Yeah. So that certainly has always conceptually been a future we wanted to explore. The vSphere implementation also uses Terraform, so I think there's some overlap there in terms of us using Terraform to bootstrap an environment. So I don't know if it'd be possible to also converge that one. That would be kind of nice. I think it's definitely conceptually aligned with where we wanted to go. I think tactically we'd have to figure out, like you said, who would be contributing the dev cycles to actually get that code sort of integrated into a controller underneath the cluster API. So I don't know if you guys have any dev cycles that you can contribute there or not.
I'll reach out to Dan and see if we can allocate some of that and see how it goes.
That'd be awesome. Thanks.
So I can speak from the vSphere point of view a little bit. We just recently added the vSphere supporting the cross cloud, and we just have kind of a fresh experience there. And the thing is, we haven't looked into cluster API in a depth, so I don't fully understand how much overlap there in terms of the provider implementation. Certainly, this is something interesting, and we will look into that.
Right now, I'm not involved with no one else.
So
we have a cross-cloud channel, I believe, on Slack. And so if someone wouldn't mind dropping the link to that, that would be great. Maybe we can continue the conversation there.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll point a couple people from our side that might be interested in that Slack channel too. Can someone drop it directly into the meeting notes? Because the chat gets lost when the meeting ends. There it is. Excellent. Thank you. Cool. Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. I'm excited to see where that goes. All right. Anything else? Going once.
Well, so I've been thinking a little bit about how to support multiple masters with Cluster API. In fact, that's what we're working on with the SSH provider, but we're not using the upstream controllers yet. And so I'm wondering, looking ahead, if we have if we want certain sort of custom, I guess, behavior from, let's say, a machine deployment controller, or maybe something like a stateful a machine deployment controller, or a stateful machine set controller, something like that, maybe would be appropriate for masters, right? Having similar semantics with identity, et cetera, like a stateful set in Kubernetes. If those things are built upstream, are they going to have extension points like the cluster controller and the machine controller have today? The actuators being those extension points. Is that something that we're thinking about? I know that we have a machine deployment and a machine set controller. I'm not sure how whether it's in use actively yet. And yeah, that's just something I've been wondering about, if anybody has any thoughts. Otherwise, happy to discuss this on Slack as well.
I know we've started thinking about what HA would look like, but I don't think we've prototyped it yet.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else has.
So I'm getting ready to start digging into this area, and I was going to try to just leverage the roles, push the role down into the provider config, and then try to leverage that to sit there and do a simple test, because we can register the API endpoints with the cluster spec. If that's available, then assuming that you're scaling up the number of control plane instances rather than doing an init there. But that's just my initial kind of hack yet. We haven't gotten to the point where we're actually starting to try to spin those up.
Yeah, I think the part that is sort of most nebulous right now is some of the sort of some of the states. So for example, if you need to, if you want to scale an etcd cluster, right, you need to tell the incoming peer about the existing peers. Where do you place that information? Right now for the SSH provider work, we're placing that in the cluster provider status. Ferrying around this kind of information. I'm not sure if the cluster object is the right place for that. Maybe it'll be some sort of deployment object in the future, but then or not a deploy. Yeah, that's sort of what I'm wondering about.
So have you seen the latest HA docs that we published for HA KubeADM deployments?
Yeah.
So I think the kind of add method there, you can kind of do the introspection through the API endpoint to get the data that you need. I don't know if we necessarily have to kind of record that as we go.
I see. Okay. Let me. Maybe I missed something last time. This is a recent update. I'll take a look.
A week or two ago. I have a quick question. The last time I read the HA Kubernetes documentation, it was explicitly recommended that you do not resize etcd clusters. Is that invalid? Was it never valid?
It's complicated.
Well, I know it's complicated to do. Is it complicated? Well,
I don't think there's any Kubernetes issue with it. If you have a solution, whether it uses the etcd operator, I'm working on the etcd manager, or whether you have your own tooling, if you magically get etcd to resize correctly, then I don't think Kubernetes has an issue with it.
Sure.
But I think that if is a very big if.
Yeah, I think what Justin said is correct. Is Kubernetes shouldn't care if etcd is changing size underneath it, as long as it still exposes etcd consistently. So if you can finagle etcd to do things underneath Kubernetes, Kubernetes should just keep working.
Yeah, the one aspect that's weird is the endpoints that you pass to the API server. Because if you're adding new members versus dynamically sizing a VM or something of that nature.
So that's less of an issue, I think, with the co-located etcd, because the endpoints that you pass into the API server only need to be able to hit one of the endpoints. It doesn't need to be the full list of endpoints. It'll get the full list of endpoints once it contacts the endpoint it's configured for.
All right, and with that, we are now officially out of time. Thank you everyone for coming, and we will see folks again next week. There were a number of action items and follow-up conversations we had in Slack, so I'd encourage people to take care of those quickly before they forget. That's what I'm going to try to do. And anyway, otherwise, everybody have a great week. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks.